Hello and welcome back. Well, we've completed steps 1, 2, and 3 of configuring our instance, and we have now moved into step 4 where we now have to select and add storage for our EC2 instance. So over here in the Orion papers, let's click on EC2 storage, and now we're going to talk about the two types of storage that are available, and those are Elastic Block Store, otherwise known as EBS, and Instance Store. So I have two sections here for EBS because this is the most common and most in-depth type of storage we're going to talk about, but we will briefly touch on Instance Store because that is something that you're going to need to know for the CSA exam. So let's first talk about Elastic Block Store, or more commonly referred to as EBS. Now, important things to understand about EBS is that EBS volumes are persistent, meaning that they can live beyond the life of the EC2 instance that they are attached to. Now, that is the main difference between the EBS volume and an instance store volume. EBS-backed volumes are network-attached storage, meaning that they can be attached and detached to or from various EC2 instances. So an EBS volume is not physically attached to the host machine that is running the EC2 instance. They are located somewhere else in the data center, and they are network attached. They are not physically attached. However, it's important to understand that they can only be attached to one EC2 instance at a time. You cannot have an EBS volume that is attached to two instances at the exact same time. EBS volumes have the benefit of being backed up into a snapshot, which we're going to talk about later on in this section, and these snapshots can be later restored into new EBS volumes. So it's a really great backup feature that provides an easy way to restore backed up volumes. So now let's talk about EBS performance. And this is something where we start to get a little more technical than we have been. So we'll walk through this a little slowly, but it is very important to understand. And that is that EBS volumes measure input and output operations in something called IOPS. Now, IOPS are input-output operations per second. So this is basically how fast data can be moved in and out of the storage volume. So this will directly affect the performance of this volume and therefore the instance, and then therefore your application. So it's important to understand that AWS measures IOPS in 256 kilobyte chunks, or smaller if they happen to be smaller. Operations that are greater than 256 kilobytes are separated into individual 256 kilobyte chunks. For example, a 256 kilobyte operation would count as 2 IOPS. So if I were to move in or move out 256 kilobytes from the EBS volume, that would count as 2 IOPS. Now, the type of EBS volume you specify greatly influences the input-output performance your device will receive. And we'll talk about the types of volumes when we talk about EBS types in a few minutes. Also, it is important as architects to understand if your application requires more or less I/O when selecting an EBS volume. So it's very, very important to understand what type of performance your application is going to need so you can select the right volume and, again, the right instance type to meet the needs of your application. Also, even volumes with provisioned IOPS may not produce the performance you'd expect. If this is the case, an EBS optimized instance type is required, which prioritizes EBS traffic. So even within EBS volumes, we have volumes that are specific to having increased or greater IOPS performance. But if you remember, we also have instance types that are EBS optimized. Now, we can take a look at that quickly by jumping over to another tab here. We'll go back to our to our EC2 dashboard. I'll launch another instance. And here under instance type, under EBS optimize, you will see that there are some instances which are noted as yes in this column. These are EBS optimized instances. And if we just mouse over the indicator here, it says that it indicates whether the instance type supports EBS optimization. An EBS optimized instance provides additional dedicated throughput for Amazon EBS input output. This provides improved performance for your Amazon EBS volume and enables instances to use provisioned IOPS fully. So if you're running an application and you really need to max out I/O performance, then you really need to have both a provisioned IOPS EBS volume running on a EBS optimized instance type. Okay, so let's take a quick look over here just at what's going on when we're selecting our storage. Every single instance must have a root volume. This is going to be the hard drive that the operating system is installed on. Now, during the creation process, we can always add more volume. So I can click here, add a volume, add another volume, add another one, or even add a fifth volume. And then within these, adjust the size, select the volume types, and thus also adjust the IOPS. However, we're not going to need all of these for now, so I'll remove some of these, but I just wanted to show you that you can add many volumes at once during the creation process. Now, another important concept to understand when we're talking about EBS volumes is pre-warming EBS volumes. So the first time that data is written to an EBS volume, AWS runs an industry standard deletion process to overwrite any existing data that may be on the volume, because these volumes that we're going to provision and add to our instance very well may have been used by somebody else yesterday, the day before, or a week before, and some of that data may still be on those volumes. Now, you can't access that data, but the first time that you go to access the volume, AWS is going to run this process to delete all that information. Now, during this deletion process, the volume performance will be degraded. And as a solution, you can pre-warm the volume by writing dummy data onto the volume before it is used in a production environment. Therefore, you're forcing AWS to run that deletion process. Therefore, when you put the EC2 instance with the EBS volume attached into production, you won't have any of that initial performance degradation. So pre-warming is a very important concept to know as part of being an architect and also for the exam, because there very well may be questions specific to this concept. So now let's talk about various EBS types. If I select on volume type here, you're going to see for the root that there is general purpose SSD, provisioned IOPS SSD, and magnetic, and you see them all listed here. So let's talk about what each one of these are. General purpose SSD is best used for dev or test environments and smaller database instances. They have a performance of 3 IOPS per gigabyte of storage size with burstable and baseline performance. So if we take a look right here and we see where it says 100/300, well, that means that this volume has a baseline of 100 IOPS, burstable up to 3,000 IOPS. But what does that mean? What does burstable mean? Well, one of the nice things about using a T2 type instance is that it has the ability to temporarily burst performance based on demand or during times, short periods of time of heavy demand. So you'll always have the baseline of 100, but every once in a while, if you need to suddenly just really have a greater amount of performance, it has the ability to burst for that short amount of time up to 3,000 IOPS. Now, in the SysOps and the developer certification courses, we go into detail about how that's calculated, but for the solutions architect exam, you just need to be aware of what IOPS are and the fact that they are burstable in certain situations. Now, it's also important to understand that when provisioning these EBS volumes, if we know that general purpose SSD is giving us 3 IOPS per gigabyte and we have an 8 gigabyte size volume, that would be a performance of 24 IOPS. However, if I were to increase this, let's say to 100 gigabytes of size, then I would be exceeding or going above the baseline and I would be getting 300 IOPS in terms of performance for this volume. So the size has a direct relationship to the amount of IOPS you are going to have for any EBS volumes. Now let's talk about provisioned IOP SSDs. So I'll select that down here. And with provisioned IOP SSDs, they are used for mission-critical applications that require sustained IOPS performance. So this is not going to be burstable. This is going to be the IOPS that we select here is going to be the IOPS that we are always going to get. So if you always need to have 2,000 IOPS, 3,000 IOPS, up to 20,000 IOPS. You can select that here and you're always guaranteeing that you're going to have that performance available, where with burstable IOPS, you're only getting that amount for a very short amount of time. So it's great for large database workloads, things that are going to be very input-output intensive. So here, for example, say that we want to have a volume size of 1,000 gigabytes. We can then select the IOPS that we want and say put this at 6,000. And what we are doing is we're guaranteeing that we're going to have a baseline IOPS of 6,000. So this is the type of storage that we want to be using if we have an application that is going to require a high level of sustained IOPS. The next type of storage that we should know about is magnetic. Now, magnetic is low-cost storage, and it's really just used for workloads where performance is not important or data isn't frequently accessed. This is an option, but it's something that is very rarely used these days. Also, let's talk over here about this option for delete on termination. Because these are network attached and they're persistent, meaning that they can live past the life of this particular instance, we can select these to either delete on termination, meaning that any data that is on these volumes will be deleted when we terminate the instance, or we can uncheck these, meaning that when we delete the instance or terminate the instance will be removed from our account, but under the EBS section of the EC2 console, we will be able to view these volumes and attach them to a different EC2 instance. So it's important to note that if you want an EBS volume to live beyond the life of the instance that you're creating it with, to make sure to have these unchecked, because if they're checked, you're going to lose them when you terminate the instance. Okay, so now let's talk about instance store volumes. Now, instance store volumes are virtual devices whose underlying hardware is actually physically attached to the host computer that is running the instance. Instance store volumes are considered ephemeral data. Remember that. Ephemeral data. Instance store volumes are ephemeral data. And that means that the data on the volumes only exist for the duration of the life of the instance. So there's no option when you select an instance store volume. When the instance is terminated, you will lose that data. Also, once the instance is stopped or shut down, the data is also erased. The instance, however, can be rebooted and still maintain its ephemeral data. So again, instance store volumes are ephemeral. Remember that. And that means the data will be lost if the instance is stopped, shut down, or terminated. It will only be maintained if the instance is rebooted. Very important to remember all of that. Now, for a lot of instance types, you cannot select instance store as a volume type. However, if we go back and we view our instance types, we can see here under instance storage, we selected the T2 micro and that is EBS only. However, if I select one that doesn't say EBS only, let's say this one here, this M3 medium, and I just kind of quickly go through the next option and come here to storage, and I add a new volume, I can select an instance store volume. So if you need to select an instance store volume for some reason, this is how you would go about doing that. So again, the major takeaways from these are that EBS volumes are persistent and they're network attached, meaning you can move them from one EC2 instance to another and they can live beyond the life of the EC2 instance they're created with. And instance store volumes are ephemeral data. They do not live past the lifespan of the EC2 instance that they are created with. And if the instance is stopped or shut down, the data will be erased. Very important to remember. So that's a quick summary of instance storage. And what we're going to do here is let me close out this tab, go back to our main EC2 instance. I'm going to provision this with the root device as a general purpose SSD, and then also one additional EBS volume. We will make this 8 GB. We'll put this down to 8 GB as well, and I'll change this back to general purpose. And what I'll do for argument's sake is I will select the root volume to be terminated on deletion, but I will not have the additional EBS volume terminated on deletion. So now that we have a better understanding of the storage for our EC2 instance, we can move on to add tags. Now this is something I'll just spend about 30 seconds on here. Tagging again is a way to organize and put names onto our EC2 instances. So as an example, I can just add this as dev EC2 as an example. And next we'll move on to configuring our security groups for the EC2 instance. So with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.